When Madison Huntington, 34 years old, heiress to a $1,200 million automotive empire, walked into that garage on the outskirts of Los Angeles, accompanied by her two socialite friends, she did so with the same arrogance she had lived with her entire life. They saw the grease-covered mechanic working under the hood of an old Ford Taurus, and the three of them laughed as if they were at a zoo, observing something exotic and pathetic. Madison approached in her $2,000 Louboutins, knocked on the table with her perfect nails, and asked for advice about her broken Ferrari, but she did it with so much contempt that it seemed like she was asking a beggar for spare change. The mechanic looked up, stared directly into her eyes with a calm that confused everyone present, and spoke 12 words that not only left her frozen, but shattered every certainty she had built about who she was and what it meant to have value. Because what Madison didn't know was that this dirty and poor man, the one she had just humiliated in front of her friends, held a secret that would forever change her definition of wealth. If you're ready for this story, right where you're watching this video from, David Chen's auto repair shop was located in Carson, one of those working-class neighborhoods on the outskirts of Los Angeles, where people lived on modest salaries and honest dreams. It was a small place with oil-stained walls that told decades of hard work, tools hanging from rusty hooks, and that characteristic smell of gasoline and metal that permeates every place where cars are repaired out of calling rather than fortune. The concrete floor was covered with oil stains that mapped the history of each repair, each mechanical suffering healed with patience and skill. On the walls hung old calendars from auto parts brands, yellowed photographs of restored cars, and a portrait of old Mr. Rodriguez, who seemed to watch over the shop with kind eyes from his worn wooden frame. David was 42 years old, had been working in this shop since he was 18, first as an apprentice to Mr. Rodriguez, who had given him a chance when no one else would, and now as owner since Rodriguez died 5 years ago, leaving him the business. He was a quiet man with large, calloused hands that bore the scars of 1,000 repairs, each cut and burn an honor medal earned in the trenches of honest work. He had the kind of wisdom that only comes from a life of honest labor and significant losses, that deep understanding that a person's true value isn't measured in dollars, but in integrity. His work uniform was perpetually stained with grease. He wore dark hair, always disheveled from hours bent over engines, and his green eyes had that depth of someone who has seen so much pain that nothing surprises them anymore, but hasn't lost the ability to feel compassion. That June afternoon, he was working under the hood of a 2005 Ford Taurus, a car that had been in the shop for 3 weeks, waiting for a part the owner couldn't afford to buy new, and that David was trying to source used to not charge him more. It was the kind of gesture he constantly made, these acts of silent kindness that his neighborhood customers knew, but that never crossed the borders of his small world. The sound of a powerful and expensive engine broke the usual silence of the shop. David didn't look up immediately, accustomed to the cars that passed on the nearby street, but then he heard laughter. Female laughter with that artificial tone that people have who laugh not from joy, but from contempt. 3 women entered the shop as if they were stepping into a minefield. All wore designer clothes, impossible heels for an oil-stained concrete floor, handbags that cost more than the shop's monthly rent. But it was the one in the center who commanded the group, a tall and elegant woman with perfectly straight chestnut hair, impeccable makeup, and that expression on her face that only those who have never had to ask for anything in their lives have. Madison Huntington was exactly what she looked like. Old money, inherited privilege, and zero awareness of how 99% of humanity lived. She was the only daughter of Richard Huntington, the late magnate of luxury car dealerships who had built an empire selling Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Bentley to the ultra-rich of America. She had inherited everything 2 years ago when her father died, and since then had managed the business with the same cold efficiency with which she selected her shoes. Her two friends, Ashley and Brittany, were slightly less wealthy versions of herself. Women defined by their marriages to businessmen and the unlimited credit cards they carried in their Hermes bags. They had entered that shop by accident, or rather by necessity, after Madison's Ferrari F8 Tributo had started making a strange noise in the engine while they were returning from a 3-hour lunch in Beverly Hills. Madison had searched for the nearest shop on the GPS, and David's name had appeared. She didn't know it was a neighborhood shop for regular cars. She didn't know that David had probably never worked on a Ferrari. She didn't care to know. For her, a mechanic was a mechanic, and all were interchangeable like the parts they repaired. She knocked with her perfect nails on the metal table where David had his invoices scattered. The sound echoed through the shop like a judge striking his gavel. David straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that only managed to redistribute the grease, and looked at them with a neutral expression they mistook for stupidity. Madison spoke with that voice of someone who is used to being obeyed. She told him her Ferrari was making a weird noise, and she needed him to check it immediately. The words came out of her mouth like orders, not requests. Her friends laughed behind her, making comments in low voices about how quaint the place was, how it smelled like poverty. How funny it would be to tell their other friends that Madison had brought her $400,000 Ferrari to a neighborhood garage. David listened to them without changing his expression. He had seen people like this before, obviously not in his shop, but in life. People who believed their money made them better, that their expensive clothes were armor against the shared humanity that connected them with the rest of mortals. He felt no anger toward them. He felt something sadder, compassion. He explained calmly that this shop wasn't equipped to work on a Ferrari, that they needed an official dealership or at least a shop specialized in supercars. His voice was deep but kind, without a trace of the humiliation they were trying to provoke. Madison snorted impatiently, as if he were a slow child who didn't understand simple instructions. Then something happened that changed the tone of everything. Ashley, the cruelest of the three friends, pointed with her perfectly manicured finger at the old Taurus David had been working on. She asked in a mocking voice if that was his car, if people really drove those things. Brittany added that it probably cost less than her shoes. And Madison, the leader of the group, always needing to prove she was the wittiest, finished with an observation she thought was funny. She said it was curious that someone who drove garbage pretended to know anything about real cars. She added that his knowledge of mechanics was probably as limited as the value of his life. The three laughed. It was a loud, cruel laugh, musical in its malice, the kind of laugh designed not just to hurt, but to destroy, the kind of laugh that reduces a person to less than nothing. And in that moment, something changed in David's eyes. It wasn't anger, because anger is hot, and what shone in his eyes was cold as ice. It was decision. The decision that these women, who had never known a difficult day in their lives, needed to hear something no one had ever told them. He approached Madison with slow steps, still with the dirty rag in his hands, and stopped less than a meter in front of her. He looked directly into her eyes. Those green eyes that had seen too much, and spoke with a voice so calm it was more devastating than any scream. He told her that he noticed she had a much more serious problem than her Ferrari. He said he could see in her eyes, in the way she moved, in her desperate need to humiliate others, that she was deeply unhappy, that all her money, all her expensive clothes, all her arrogance were just attempts to fill a void that not even she understood. And then he spoke the words that would mark her forever. He told her that the real advice she needed wasn't about her car, but about her life. That when you build your value based on what you have, and not on who you are, you become a person as empty as a car without an engine. It may look beautiful on the outside, but inside there's only noise, and nothing really works. The silence that followed was absolute. Madison's friends stopped laughing. Madison herself froze, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. No one had ever spoken to her like that in her entire life. No one had dared. David took a step back, returned to his Taurus, and continued working as if nothing had happened. The three women left the shop without saying another word, got into the Ferrari and drove away. But in Madison's mind, something fundamental had just broken, and in the weeks that followed, that break would only grow. Madison didn't sleep that night, nor the next, nor the one after that. The mechanic's words had planted something in her mind that grew like weeds, invasive and impossible to ignore, spreading into every corner of her consciousness until there was no room for anything else. She woke up at 3 a.m. in her 200-square-meter penthouse in Beverly Hills, staring at the coffered ceiling that had cost $30,000, mentally repeating every syllable he had said. The air conditioning kept the temperature perfect. The Egyptian silk sheets were soft against her skin, but none of that mattered, because inside she was burning with a question she couldn't answer. Empty like a car without an engine. The metaphor was so simple it hurt, so precise it was impossible to deny, so true that every attempt to refute it only confirmed it more. She began to observe herself in ways she never had before. She looked in the mirror not to check her makeup, but to search for the person behind, digging deeper beyond the layers of aesthetic care and designer clothing. Who was Madison Huntington? Without the name, without the money, without the designer clothes, without the armor of superiority she had built stone by stone since childhood. The answer she found terrified her to the point of trembling. There was no one, just a collection of possessions and poses, an expensive hologram projected over the most absolute void.
This story hit you, didn't it? Tap that little like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, let's keep going.
A performance so convincing that even she herself had forgotten it was just that, a performance. She began to remember things she had buried. Her father, a man who had taught her that people's value was measured in dollars, that kindness was weakness, that the poor were poor because they were stupid or lazy. She remembered her mother, a beautiful woman who had died when Madison was 12 years old, and how after her death her father had simply hired nannies and sent her to expensive boarding schools in Switzerland. There were never hugs, never conversations about feelings, only expectations of excellence, and the implicit understanding that her value lay in maintaining the family empire. She remembered moments from her childhood where she had tried to be kind, to be different, to be more than what her father expected her to be. Once, at 9 years old, she had invited a less fortunate classmate to her birthday party in the family mansion garden. The girl was named Emma, and always wore the same patched uniform, ate simple sandwiches, while the others bought from the school cafeteria. Madison had invited her because Emma had lent her her eraser without asking for anything in return. Such a simple gesture that had touched something deep inside her. Her father had severely reprimanded her afterward, taking her to his office lined with books he never read, and explaining in a cold voice that that girl wasn't from their social circle, that she needed to learn to maintain boundaries, that compassion was a luxury the rich couldn't afford, because it created incorrect expectations. The girl was never invited again. Madison learned the lesson, and with each such lesson, a part of her died, replaced by the shining armor of privilege without soul. But now, at 34 years old, that lesson seemed cruel. It seemed like a loss. She began to notice things in her daily life that she had previously ignored. The way she treated her building's cleaning staff, practically invisible except when something wasn't perfect. The way she spoke to waiters with orders instead of requests. How her friendships were transactional, based on status and convenience, not on real affection. Ashley and Brittany called constantly, wanting to go shopping, go to restaurants, gossip about other people. Madison began declining invitations. When they asked what was wrong with her, she didn't know what to say. How do you explain that a grease-covered mechanic had shown her a mirror and she didn't like what she saw? 3 weeks after the incident, Madison drove back to Carson, this time alone and in a more discreet Mercedes. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel the entire drive. She rehearsed words that sounded wrong, almost turned around 3 times. But something stronger than her fear pushed her forward. The shop was open. David was working on the same Taurus. When he saw her enter, he showed no surprise. He straightened up, wiped his hands, and waited with that patience she now recognized as wisdom. Madison had rehearsed a speech, but when she stood before him, it all disappeared. Instead, she did something she hadn't done since childhood. She apologized. Clumsily, sincerely, full of pauses, she told him he was right, that she had thought about it every day since, that she didn't know how to change, but wanted to try. David listened, without interrupting. Then he offered her coffee. Instant Folgers in a cup with a grease stain on the rim. Madison drank it, and it tasted better than any coffee she had ever had, because it meant something. They talked for 2 hours. David told her about his wife Sarah, the elementary school teacher who had died of cancer at 38 because they couldn't afford the expensive experimental treatments. Since then, he had dedicated his life to helping people in the neighborhood, repairing cars for little money, giving jobs to kids without opportunities. He spoke about real wealth, human connections, purpose, knowing your life matters to someone. It wasn't a sermon. It was a conversation between 2 people, one who was finally listening and another who had learned to speak only when it was worth it. The following months saw a transformation in Madison that her acquaintances found bewildering. She started small, treating service people with respect, learning their names, asking about their families. Then it grew. She engaged in the actual management of her company, not just signing papers, but understanding employees, improving working conditions, implementing scholarship programs. She established a foundation with $20 million from her personal fortune, dedicated to paying medical treatments for families who couldn't afford them. She didn't do it with fanfare or press conferences. She did it quietly, because she had learned that good deeds don't need advertising to have value. Her old friends stopped calling. The social circles she had frequented now found her boring, too serious, too changed. Madison discovered she didn't miss them. Instead, she found new connections, the foundation staff she managed, the families she helped, and strangely, the mechanic from Carson, who had become something like a friend. She visited David's shop once a week. Sometimes she brought coffee, good coffee this time, and pastries from a neighborhood bakery. Other times she just sat on an old chair and watched him work, finding peace in the honesty of manual labor. They talked about philosophy, about loss, about how to build a life that matters. 1 year after that first encounter, Madison came to the shop with a proposal. She wanted to open a network of non-profit auto repair shops in low-income neighborhoods, places where people could bring their cars and pay what they could afford. She wanted David to lead the project, not as an employee but as a partner. David listened to the entire proposal before responding. Then he smiled, that calm smile of someone who understands the universe, sometimes has a sense of humor. He said yes, but with one condition, that she work in the first shop for 6 months, learning the trade, getting her hands dirty, really understanding what it meant. Madison accepted without hesitation. The following 6 months were the most difficult and rewarding of her life. She learned to change oil, diagnose engine problems, deal with customers who came with old cars and fragile hopes. She broke 2 nails, stained all her clothes, burned herself on hot engines. And she was happier than at any other point in her previous life. The neighborhood customers began to know her, first with distrust, then with acceptance, finally with affection. Mrs. Garcia, who brought her '97 Chevy Cavalier, began bringing her homemade tamales. Miguel, the taxi driver with 3 kids, taught her to play dominoes during lunch breaks. She became part of a community in a way her money never could have bought. 2 years after that day, when she had first walked into the shop with arrogance and contempt, Madison Huntington had changed so much she was almost unrecognizable. Not physically, though she now wore less makeup and more practical clothes. The change was deeper in the way she moved through the world, how she looked at people, what she valued. The network of non-profit shops had expanded to 5 locations across Los Angeles. Hundreds of families had been helped. Young men had found work and purpose. Cars that would have been scrap kept driving on the roads. The medical foundation had paid treatments for 53 people, saving lives the system would have let die. But for Madison, the most important change wasn't in the statistics. It was in how she felt when she woke up in the morning. There was no more emptiness. There was purpose. There was no more hollow noise inside her. There was something that really worked. One Sunday afternoon, sitting in the closed shop, sharing a beer after finishing a particularly difficult job, Madison told David something she had been thinking about for months. She thanked him for that day, for telling her the truth when no one else would, for seeing her as a person who needed help, instead of as a rich customer who deserved resentment. David looked at her with those calm green eyes that had seen so much suffering and responded with the simple wisdom that only comes from living authentically. He told her that he hadn't changed her, that she had always had everything necessary to be who she was now. She just needed someone to show her the mirror. He told her that the greatest wealth isn't what you have in the bank, but what you give to the world. That success isn't measured in properties or cars, but in lives touched, in real connections, in going to sleep, knowing that day you mattered to someone. Madison understood then something fundamental. That day in the shop, when she had entered with arrogance and been humiliated by a poor mechanic, hadn't been a defeat, it had been a gift. The gift of seeing the truth, the gift of a second chance to build a life worth living. Years later, when people asked Madison about her transformation, about how a billionaire had ended up working with her hands and dedicating her fortune to helping others, she always told the story of the mechanic from Carson. She told about the 12 words that left her frozen. She told how sometimes the greatest wealth someone can give you isn't money, but truth. And she always ended the story with the same reflection, that she had spent 34 years building an empty life that was beautiful on the outside. And it only took a moment of brutal honesty with a stranger to realize she had been driving a Ferrari without an engine. Beautiful, expensive, impressive at first glance, but fundamentally broken and unable to get anywhere that mattered. Real life, she had learned, wasn't about the speed or luxury of the vehicle. It was about the journey, who travels with you. And whether at the end of the road you could look back and see you had left more than expensive tire tracks on indifferent pavement. Madison Huntington was still a billionaire. She still had her penthouse and her name and her inheritance. But now she also had something no amount of money could buy. She had an engine that worked. She had purpose. She had humanity. And it all began with a dirty mechanic from a neighborhood shop who had the courage to tell her the truth when everyone else just wanted her money. Sometimes the greatest fortune comes disguised as humiliation. Sometimes the best advice comes from the most unlikely place. And sometimes, just sometimes, all you need to change your life is for someone to show you the mirror and let you decide if you like what you see. If this story made you reflect on what really matters in life, leave me a heart down below. And if you want to support stories like this that speak about real transformation and second chances, you can leave a little "thank you so much" through the Super Thanks feature. Every gesture counts. Just like it counted that day when David decided to speak the truth instead of staying silent. Because you chose to stay until the end, and that says a lot about who you are.